start off here. So there's me. So there's there is, of course, community sociology, and as the notion of community in sociology is at once sort of a subfield that not all sociologists you talk to would recognize, and something that we've done as long as people have been thinking about sociology. So we as sociologists, we somewhat arrogantly claim the first sociologist to have been Aristotle. So we go way back in science. But in terms of community sociology, really Aristotle informs the beginnings of our thinking about what constitutes a community. And if you're working in cities, then you want to understand, what is this community? What does it mean to have a community? And to what extent is the municipality a community? Is the metropolis a community? Or are communities smaller organizational units? And if so, why? Right? And we really can start with sort of Aristotle's notion of the polis as being part of how we think about what constitutes community. And then as we move into the industrial era, we pull from Emile Durkheim, who wrote about the relationships among people in modern societies. And he was best known, his most famous work is La Suicide, which is a study of what contributes to suicide in modern societies. And what he found out of it, importantly, was the notion that suicide can come in the context of very tightly restrictive tight bonds, right? So think of women who are forced to marry because of tradition somebody who they find repulsive, right? That would be one form of one of the drivers of suicide. And we can think of other, farmers who in India who see no option other than to be farmers, but cannot provide for their family as farmers because of broader policies, those kinds of things. But the other thing that drove people to suicide in modern society, France in the late 1800s, was complete isolation that comes from being in a grand industrial society, right? And we hear of these situations from time to time in modern society, right? Everything from the character student who carried out a massacre at Virginia Tech University came from a suburban community outside of Washington, D.C., where literally no one knew his family. Neighbors simply, they had seen them, but nobody knew anything about that family. They were completely isolated from the rest of the community. And it's this notion of what Durkheim called anomie. That is one of the things that plagues, in the context of the United States, we've heard of, there's the famous case in, I think it was the 1950s, where the woman was severely attacked in New York City, and no one came to her aid, even though hundreds of people witnessed it from buildings, right? So, anomie is one of the, and really what the point is, really what Durkheim was studying was, what does community mean? Right? It's not just an agglomeration of people, it is some form of connection. And there are issues that come about when those connections are broken, when people just live together and don't actually have forms of solidarity, relationships of solidarity. And then Weber, while thinking about communities, thought about two things. What was it that made communities, the culture of communities, if you will, right? Some communities are very, if you will, can-do, right? They are hit with a The example we have in the United States is the comparison within 2 months of Greenville, Kansas, and New Orleans, Louisiana. They both get hit with catastrophic natural disasters. In New Orleans, Louisiana, what it did was bear, for all of us, the deep inequalities that were part of life in New Orleans, Louisiana. And the dysfunctional nature of the community that was unable to prepare for, much less respond to, a catastrophic disaster. Greenville, Kansas, obviously a much smaller place, town of about 2,000, was also hit. There was about a mile-wide tornado that went right across Greenville, Kansas, basically demolished the town, almost literally. There were 4 or 5 deaths. But what was remarkable was within a week, Greenville, Kansas was trying to figure out, okay, how do we rebuild? What do we rebuild? Do we really want to rebuild in the same way that we had before? There were some things we didn't like about our community before. It was this notion that, all right, we've been hit by this act of a greater being, but now let's pick up the pieces. How do we work together to make this a better place? This could be an opportunity. And they were able to raise money, to use government money and private money, and to build a community that was in some ways better than they'd had previously. And what Durkheim was asking 100 years prior was, what makes a Greenville, Kansas versus New Orleans, Louisiana, that can effectively, in modern parlance, we talk about it in terms of resilience, right? The ability to take a disaster and turn it around versus the ability to see this as one more piece of evidence that the world's against us, right? That we just can't get along. And then Karl Marx, while talking about class, and Marxists tend not to spend a lot of time thinking about community, except that they often think about community as the locus for struggle. And the design of communities as being part of where industries locate, part of where class challenges or class inequities are located, becomes a very important part of understanding Marxism, understanding the relationships between classes in society, right? So in communities is where these things become apparent. So,
and community in that area is not really national.
No, in other words, you can do a national analysis using Marxian techniques.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to get down to where the struggles actually happen, there are of course national struggles that happen. But if you think about labor, the labor struggles it's actually relatively rare that you get something like what's happening right now, which is that PSIRU has managed to get fast food workers across the country mobilizing about wages and benefits. What is more common is that the workers at local blah 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 will organize against the Goodrich plant in said community because of wages and benefits, and some of that is an artifact of the way that labor organizing was codified in the United States in particular, but it was codified that way in part because labor organizers organized that way, right? So much of labor is about relationships between local managers and local workers. So yes, you can think about it nationally, but in particular, there are opportunities to think about things as a local factor as well. When we think about some of the great labor struggles, certainly in Michigan, they're in, for instance, the mining extraction communities in the UP. And really it's about the miners organizing locally and management hiring goons locally, and then they would draw on outsiders to each would draw on outsiders to strengthen their cause, but it was really a local struggle. And community figures into that, how community was organized. Where does management live versus where does labor live? How exposed are they to the goods and the bads of the production facility? What is the price of, what commodities are available in the management areas versus the local areas? So all of that can be seen as a local issue, even as it has national consequences. So, if we want to move from the classic sociologists to understanding what sociologists can provide us, we need to think about the, if you will, the strings of urban sociology. And the Chicago, this is where we bring in, we talked about the Chicago School. And this is where we bring in the great work of the Chicago School, which was really about, William White's work of saying, okay, what are places? What do they mean? How do they get imbued with meaning? Who gives them that meaning? Right? What gives them? What social forces give them that meaning? And White, of course, was famous, maybe of course for me, maybe not of course for me, but White was famous for doing things like setting up cameras on a place and just observing what would happen over a 4-day period in a place to try to understand how society organized around a central place in a given city. Right? Building on White's work, there have been sociologists who've thought about proactive interventions in places. So there's a famous study where in New York City, in Washington Square Park, I think. It's the one down by New York University, which had become one of those places where you went if you wanted to buy drugs or other things. And so the sociologists working with the city said, okay, so what happens if we set up a cappuccino shop in the middle of the park, right? Big open square park? And so they studied the effects of putting in this new cappuccino stand. Well, as it turns out, people who sell marijuana and heroin and other drugs or prostitutes are not big cappuccino drinkers in the context of the United States. And in fact, Wall Street people are. And so through having what became regarded as a really trendy cappuccino place in the middle of Washington Square Park, without the police really having to do very much, the whole social interaction in that park changed. Because you had the Wall Street people coming in, buying their cappuccino, and that was enough to make the people who were selling marijuana and cocaine and heroin a little bit uncomfortable. And so they moved to another place, right? It reclaimed that space. And in a period of about 5 years, the place was transformed from being sort of dirty and unpleasant to being a place where people play chess, and you've got lots of trendy folks coming in and buying their cappuccinos. So places not only have symbolic meaning, in other words, they are socially created by who goes in and who doesn't, but that you can intervene in those places to change their dynamics. The other thing, the older studies the other studies for which the Chicago School really became famous were these studies of what became known as urban ecology, which has very little to do with natural resources, right? Almost nothing to do with natural resources, in fact, except that occasionally they do talk about what resources are available. But really what they were talking about were the dynamics of change within urban places. And it's in some ways a distinctly American story, although I expect that in most places now there's some variant of it. But they would describe how neighborhoods would slowly become populated by one particular type of person, right? So you think of Pilsen in Chicago, and if you are you think of Pilsen in Chicago as being the place where you go to find things Mexican in particular, right? So you have taquerias, you have Mexican restaurants. That neighborhood came to be known as the Mexican town. And in fact, part of what would happen is that you would have people of Mexican origin, immigrants of Mexican origin moving in, and then others would come and would join them. And over time, you had a community that was known for being Mexican. And then the community would become imbued with that. And it was a place where the newer immigrants didn't have to know English to be able to get around. They didn't have to assimilate fully. But one of the things that would happen traditionally is that these places, while they continued to be known as Mexican town, were not where that second generation or third generation would generally settle. Right? They would, once they gained enough resources, they would then move out to the places that were of higher status. Right? Because now, as the second and third generation, they of course speak fluent English. They aren't hindered by some of the cultural barriers that a new immigrant would have had. And so there's this constant ecological change within cities of places that become Little Italy, Mexican town, the Arab areas of Dearborn. But over time, in fact, even as they've gained that name, they change character. They are not as dominated by that subpopulation as immigrants did what they did. And so then you would see almost an ecological change over time in the same way that you'll have a population of plants that dominate a particular landscape, but over time things happen that change that population. So it isn't that you achieve stability in one place, but you achieve a dynamic exchange that happens over time. Some of the new research that's a variant of the Chicago School has really been looking at the role of, if you will, private capital in creating this change, right? So the cool cities regime, as you might think about it, has led to a new form of gentrification. And Pilsen, which I brought up a minute ago, is a good example of that. Pilsen, which is still if you say Pilsen to anyone who's sort of knows Chicago, they'll say, oh yes, that's the big Hispanic area of Chicago. In fact, the Hispanic / Mexican population of Pilsen is now less than half, because it's become a trendy place for younger, upwardly mobile people to settle, right? And so Pilsen, even as it's got this identity, is in the process of changing because of the processes of gentrification. So as people find the place trendy, they move in. That, of course, that will lead to other people wanting to move in there, which then drives up land values, which means that the new Hispanic immigrants can't afford to live there anymore, which then means that you get different people into that neighborhood, and you have urban dynamics of change, which is not conflict-free, right? I'm actually a native of Washington, D.C., and I see that happening all the time in Washington. I don't know, did you guys get to go to Washington during your trip here? It's an interesting city because it's one that it has traditionally, in the last 50 years, Washington and Detroit have had a certain allegiance because they were both black-controlled cities, right? And minority-controlled cities. And what has happened over the last really 15 years is Washington has, but it was starting a long time ago, starting as I was growing up. Washington has become increasingly upwardly mobile and white, right? In fact, Washington, D.C. now has the greatest, has the highest proportion in the United States of people in the top 10% and of cities, and the highest proportion of people in the bottom 10%, right? So it's become a highly disparate city. But what's happened in the middle is it's moved from being middle class blacks to being upper to middle class whites, right? So you see this process of gentrification that changes cities, and it has led actually to a burgeoning study of the suburbs in the United States. The suburbs, of course, were traditionally thought of as where you moved when you got enough money to get out of the city. What's now happening is that the suburbs are becoming poorer as the inner cities become richer, right? So in Washington, all those people who used to live in the middle of the city are now living in the inner suburbs, which are really not actually particularly glamorous places to live. Even though you can find incredible, it's also where immigrants are tending to settle, right? So we have, in Washington, there's a very high, the ethnic group that's drawn to Washington most prominently are Salvadorans. And so you can get incredible pupuserias in the suburbs of Washington. Okay. Of course, the other thing that we do in sociology is we talk about race, class, and gender. And so I've alluded to race, I've alluded to class. I haven't talked a lot about gender, but there are quite a few studies within the canon of sociology that looks at urban settings and how they privileged particular populations or create areas of interaction. So we've had ethnographic studies going back to the 1950s. One of the famous ones is called Tally's Corner, which was a study of a corner not far from Howard University, which was a place where African American men would hang out, and it was a way of understanding that culture, done by Harry Leibowitz. The correlate of that in the modern era are some of the studies as we have a spate of national attention to deaths of young black men in the United States. We have had a series of studies done in sociology that have become quite prominent in some of our circles, doing these kinds of ethnographic studies and understanding what's going on here. Alice Goffman, who is actually the daughter, though she really never knew him, of Irving Goffman, who is a sociologist who's famous for the notion of symbolic interactionism, right? So the idea that when in every social interaction, I think about the symbols that I display to you, and you do the same for me, right? We don't just, it's not all front stage. We're always calculating. Has done a study on it's called On the Run, and it's all about that culture of judicial system, right? Civic justice that keeps black men from becoming part of the mainstream. Likewise, Victor Rios has done work on the culture of disenfranchisement that leads African Americans and Latinos in the United States into gangs, right? Again, because of this pattern of constant run-ins with the judicial system from an early age that then leads to inability to trust the basic institutions, which then leads people to looking for alternatives, right? So this is very much in the tradition of Tally's Corner, going in and doing ethnographic studies to try to understand what people do in cities and what is it that explains the emergence of particular cultures in cities. There have been other studies that look at the role of gender and how does gender get performed. And there's within urban sociology there's an emergence of what we call performativity literature, which is it builds on Goffman's notion of symbolic interactionism, but really is asking what does it mean to, how do you play the part of being a woman, or for that matter being a person of different gender orientation in the context of a city, right? And how does the city then influence how people then perform their role, right? What is acceptable, what isn't acceptable? So, for instance, in Dearborn, Michigan, the performance of being right down the road, the performance of being a Muslim woman may, in fact, involve wearing at least a headscarf, so that it becomes very clear that this is your identity, right? Even if you're not particularly religious. One of the things we found, I recently did survey analysis of the Arab American community on consumption. One of the things I found was that even among Arab Christians, only about 45% said that they had had a drink in the last month, right? Drink of alcohol, right? And there may be some people may be underreporting what they actually do, but the point would be that there's a performance of being a Muslim in America, being an Arab in America right now that involves conforming to if you will, expectations that would be classically associated with Muslims as opposed to being associated with Christians, right? I can tell you, because I've done work in Palestine, when I go into a Palestinian Christian's house, one of the things that's very prominent is that line of liquor that's on the cabinet as you come in. It's just making it very clear, this is who we are. Just let's be clear here, right? In the same way that if I were to go into a Palestinian Muslim's house, one of the things that is often very prominent is the prayer rug that's hung over a prominent door, right? Just to make it very clear, look, I pray. This is part of what I do, and that's all part of performance. And as cities change, the notion of trying to understand what the performances are that get displayed is important. And so, related to all of this is, where does this get institutionalized in bureaucratic structures, right? And bureaucratic structures that benefit whom, right? And so that's the other piece that's very important.
May I ask you a question here?
Sure, yeah.
Correct me, because I'm not a sociologist. I just heard something about Chicago school. But as far as I got it, and that was my question, whether it's urban or national. In US in 1920s, in the beginning of the 20th century, you have all the migrants coming to US, forming a society which is not that much, it's not a strong national identity that I'm Irish, I'm Brazilian, I'm Mexican. So people come, mix together, you have, Mexican towns, Irish towns, do not mixing together very well.
Right.
And they are forming a big city like Chicago. And you have all the problems that might occur because people, do not feel as part of the society. You have conflicts, you have you have crime. And then, as far as I got it, but please correct me, sociologists come to the city to change the whole thing, to do some kind of social engineering, I don't know if that's the term, but to make a change. It's not just to observe. How can we do something to integrate the society? How can we do something to make the feeling of belonging?
Yeah, well, it depends on the perspective of the sociologist.
Mm-hmm.
So there are really a couple of strains within the discipline. There is a strain within the discipline that says really our job is to make observations that can be picked up by whomever, right? To make observation gather empirical data and to construct theories that we test through gathering this data. And that then should be fed to whomever is going to do the work to make a decision about life. There's another strain of sociology that is much more about not only are we constructing theories, testing it using empirical data, but we are actively engaged in the change process. The Chicago school honestly was somewhere in between, right? Someone like William White really was interested in he was very influenced by Lefebvre. He thought there ought to be a right to a city. He thought by gathering this data, he could reflect what were supposedly public spaces were being enclosed effectively. Honestly, someone like Robert Park, his interest was in acting like a scientist. My job is not to necessarily set policy, but to simply demonstrate what's happening, and then there are whole, and you can understand, right? He was in conversation with the Jane Addams and the other urban reformers at the time, so he could have confidence that if he collected the data, he didn't have to be the one who would implement them, right? He really felt that there were activists out there, and it was their job to take that data and to then do with it what would make society a better place. So it's an interpretation of what we are as academics. Is it our job to be in the trenches also trying to make the change, or is it just our job to document what's going on and to help the world better understand what these processes are? Yeah.
So, I'm sorry. I apologize for interjecting. I'm just visiting here. I had the opportunity last week to present to the students. So another answer, I think, to the question, though, is I take from my own family experience. My mother grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the 1920s, 1930s, when you had exactly what you're talking about. You had the Jewish neighborhood, the Polish neighborhood, the Italian neighborhood. And one of the ways that these kids all came together was through the public education system.
That's true. Yeah.
Through the public education system. Then as now, people came to this country for a better life. And one of the things they tried to impart to their children was, you're going to go to school, because many of them came from Eastern Europe at that time with less than a high school education. So they imparted to their children, you're going to go to school, you're going to get a good education, and you're going to get a good job. And so the public education system at that time became the big melting pot that brought kids from these different backgrounds, cultures, nationalities together as well, aside from creating the kinds of spaces that would bring people together in the cities.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And of course, the other thing that brought people together through World War II was the military service. I know this from my own family, because my parents are, my mother's of Greek origin, my father's of German origin. They both come from relatively meager backgrounds. But we have, occasionally we get the chance to go out and visit. We have friends who own cottages. Have you ever been to a cottage on Mackinac Island? It's really quite something. But these are very, 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 very wealthy Chicago elite families that own places on this island off in the Great Lakes called Mackinac Island. Their cottage is no less, 45 rooms with servants' quarters. It's an enormous facility. Somewhat run down now, but built at the heyday of the coal barons in Chicago, back when everyone's heat came from coal. But we would never know those people, except that my father happened to serve in the military, right, with them. And so, and they were both intellectuals, and they loved books, and so they would sit around and talk about books. But that's been one of the great melting pots that largely has gone away in the United States because we got rid of conscriptive services for some good reasons. But But that was, so you had public schools and you had public schools and you had military service that really created an assimilation that may not be as prominent today. And some of that, so if we're thinking about bureaucratic structures, the demise of the public school system, especially in most American cities, is one of those bureaucratic structures that has created division in society in a very significant way in the United States. So, in fact, things are, I think it would be fair to say that in most cities in the United States, especially after elementary school, children with means go to a private school, and children without means, from families without means, go to the public schools. And so you start that division right there. And so you don't have that melting. You don't have that assimilation. And we'll get to this in a minute. You also don't then have the embedded, if you will, social capital that comes with with having a friend who knows somebody, right? Again, my parents were doing a lot better than their parents were doing, but were not particularly wealthy. But I happened to go to school with somebody who knew somebody who had a job on Capitol Hill, and so I was able to talk my way into dog walking, and then from dog walking into getting an internship on Capitol Hill when I was in college. Right? These are mechanisms you can use if you have those connections. But if the only people going to school are going to your school are other poor people, you're not going to have those opportunities. So, just see one other thing. I'm going to do urban social movements first, and as long as this isn't my daughter, it isn't. The other big part of urban sociology has been looking at urban social movements and how do they form, what kinds are they, and understanding that there are cycles of protest that have been documented, and it's not just when things get bad enough, people will protest. It's that there are a number of conditions having to do with the strength of the protest movement, the solidarity among the protest movement, but also understanding that there are different kinds of social movement organizations and understanding how they perform. So you do have, on the one hand, you have the classic, what we would call an Olinskius type urban social movement, which is really about going around, finding out what the problems are, then mobilizing people to go and protest at City Hall until the people at City Hall give enough power to the localities that they get what they want, their resources. But what's emerged actually in a lot of cities, as cities have ceased to have the resources to fulfill what it was that they were interested in, are the kinds of social movements that are much more directed towards partnerships. How do we gain the partnerships to get what we want from City Hall or from other entities, even though we can't really cry at this, shout at the steps of the mayor's house, right? It's not that there's, in my mind, that there's legitimacy in one or the other. It's that both types exist, and you have to understand what you're dealing with. Right? So I will now move into the newer strains, which is that there's been there has been the growth of movements within sociology looking at not just space and place, but in particular at environmental resources and environmental services. And so there are really two parts of this. One has been much more about the processes, right? So looking at how cities have changed to address environmental issues, right? And so they've got umpteen studies of waterfront development in cities and how that happened, who got included in the process, how was private capital leveraged. If private capital was leveraged, it was at the expense of what, right? Are there enclosures that were part of leveraging private capital to put in urban spaces? The other part of that in the urban political ecology movement has been about, even if they're not waterfronts, green spaces and the greening process. And again, what needs to be in place to make greening happen, to take what were say vacant lots or industrial development zones and turn them into something else, right? And how does greening accompany the gentrification process? And so there have been a number of studies documenting the extent to which gentrification has involved greening, but enclosed greening, right? Greening that involves parks that are either explicitly or implicitly restricted to those who have paid for the surrounding area. Related then is this question of environmental justice. And environmental justice is really looks at environmental issues but asks who is exposed to environmental problems, toxics, other things, and who gets access to environmental goods. In the environmental justice literature, there's a lot of work looking at where is the new toxic waste facility located, or where is the incinerator plant located, and to what extent does that correlate with socioeconomic status, with race, with class, but also when a community upgrades a water system, where do they choose to do the work first? Right? And if there are cost overruns and therefore the work stops, what does that mean for who has access and who doesn't? Right? Very interesting study I just read over the weekend on the water upgrades in Mumbai and what neighborhoods were systematically excluded from access from the upgrades to the water system. And how that relates to the levels of discrimination, party affiliation and levels of discrimination, for instance, against Muslims in Mumbai, right? Mumbai right now, or at least at the time the article was written, is governed by the Hindu Nationalist Party, right? So those kinds of things are very much part of this environmental justice move. So my work touches on a lot of these areas. I have done some work, I've taught social movements, and I've done some work on movements around water privatization and water rights. And I've also done work on access to food in Michigan. I won't talk a lot about that in the slide, but we can talk later if any of you are interested. And what I'll talk a lot about today is my work on how do we assess the impacts of initiatives to try to use urban greening as a strategy to help cities recover, or at least help neighborhoods recover. The other thing I won't talk about, but I mentioned a minute ago, I've got a book that I just heard this morning is going to press on leadership and leadership systems, specifically in small communities. In effect, actually, what the book is about is assessing leadership training programs and trying to understand under what makes them successful. What I will cover in my going forward is this assets-based approach that I use, and that's actually the same approach that we use to try to understand the impact of leadership studies. So, before I move forward, any questions or comments? Yeah, it's two of you.
I have a question for you. US.
I was thinking about you talk a little bit about the gentrification and all the externalities that we have. Do you know any good practice, I mean, a government policy that is addressing this issue of gentrification well?
So,
Because this is a big issue in all places, you know.
yeah, sure.
All the cities have facing this kind of problem, and it's hard to find the solution, you know, because
Yeah.
it's not easy to.
So where, what I can tell you is, I don't know if it would be classically called a best practice. Where I have seen successful efforts to, if you will, combat the negative effects of gentrification, are in those cities that have implemented things like first option co-ops, right? That allow, so there are houses that will go on the market. You can't do anything about that, but you can do. You can put in place systems that allow people who are already there to buy in, to stay in the neighborhood, right? So in Washington D.C., there's a right of first bid. There's also a couple of mechanisms in place where so like with an apartment building, if a collectivity of current renters want to buy the apartment building, if they're long-term renters, they can, and if they can form as a co-op, they have access to financing to pay the asking price. The issue for the city, obviously, is that on the one hand, they don't want to do things that will undercut the market, because that's part of how they get the revenue to continue to provide services. On the other hand, they want to be able to allow people to stay if they can. And further, they would like to be able to better distribute the benefits of land. And that's actually worked in some of the areas of Washington, D.C. So the Adams-Morgan area, while it has moved from being almost entirely Hispanic to being about half new, or even at this point somewhat old, Anglo, but more wealthy, it's still about half Hispanic, Latino, so, and low income. And that's because of the people, it happens to be part of the city that was very well organized ahead of time, so people knew about these mechanisms, they bought into the mechanisms, and you have a number of very sort of well thought of buildings and structures that are actually cooperatively owned through these mechanisms. So those kinds of things can be helpful because they allow people then to gain equity along with the growth in the neighborhood. Because the real tragedy is that people may move in when no one else will to a neighborhood, and they're sitting on pretty good housing stock, but the neighborhood itself is problematic, and so it's cheap. That's why they can move there. But when the property taxes go up, everything else, they end up moving out. They don't gain any of the benefits of having been the first in. And so it's this effort to create these benefits, to create these distributional mechanisms without being wholly distributional. Right? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. By the way, I don't know if I introduced myself. I'm Arnold Weinfeld. I'm CEO at Prima Civitas.
Oh, very nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you. But before my time there, I spent 11 years with the Michigan Municipal League, so this was at a certain area of study.
Sure.
And I just want to add, there's one example I know of. The city of Portland in Oregon has set aside for new developments that I think it's 40% have to be set aside for low and moderate income. So doesn't necessarily address the issue of real gentrification, but it does address the issue of, within gentrification, of pushing out those that are in the neighborhood that have been able to afford to live in that neighborhood.
So it still could result in some neighborhoods being gentrified.
Absolutely, in turn.
Citywide as opposed to.
And again, I mean, what you would end up, that the wisdom behind that policy would be that if you just had set-asides within neighborhoods, what you would end up are very poor enclaves that didn't have the demand to get civil services. Right. One of the things we know is that, as sociologists, is that governments respond to those who feel empowered to complain. Right. and those who feel empowered to complain are generally those who are more wealthy, right? And I went to a school. I was one of about 5% whites, relatively middle class whites that went to my elementary school. And when I think back on it, what was notable was that if you looked at the PTA, that 5% was very highly represented on the PTA. My mother was involved. My old friend Michael Ambrose's mother, who eventually went into city politics, was involved. Right? It was just I think what the studies of urban social movements show is that it's not just that they had human capital, which we'll talk about in a minute. It was that they had cultural capital. They felt like they could be involved. They felt like if they went to the PTA meetings and they said we need to apply to the city to get an upgrade to our library, that they would get that would happen. Right? They came from that background and they came from that experience. Whereas I think a lot of my classmates' parents, A, were probably working a number of jobs, but B, culturally had no reason to believe that if they appealed for extra money to the city, they would get it. Right? Their experience wasn't that, and that can make a huge difference. So, okay, so let me talk a little bit about some of the work I've done. There are two ways of thinking about how we assess what's going on in communities and how we do assessments of development interventions in communities. One way of doing this is the need-based system, right? And you go through and you tabulate everything that's wrong, right? And you think about all of the problems, and you accumulate all the problems. Now, it must be one of the things that I think I am always reminded when I give this talk to undergraduates of, is that the caveat I have to put here is that there are good reasons to do a need-based study, right? That it isn't just that if we don't focus on these and just focus on these go away. There are things that are problematic, and it's useful to document those. But as you're intervening in communities, I always bring with me this notion of, especially when I'm doing a development intervention in a community that's already poor, my job should be in part to acknowledge issues, right? But really to start thinking about what are the assets. Because people in poor communities know very well what their problems are, right? They don't need me to come in and tell them that they have a high crime rate, that only 10% of the neighborhood graduated from high school, that most of the young men in the neighborhood don't have jobs, right? They know that already. Now they may want me to document, and I can certainly do that given all of that, the median household income is $12,000 a year, and so asking them to pay $100 a month for water is really a lot more than they can afford. That can be a very useful thing, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But when I go in to work with them on trying to understand now what can this neighborhood do to try to improve their situation, I want to focus on what the community has, right? Not that they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but what is it we're going to build on? This isn't a tabula rasa where we're going to walk in and whatever development agency that wants to do is going to do. It should be building on what's there. And it should be building on it, keeping in mind what the community goals are. It should be matching with existing skills, not replicating skills. And then building on those to meet whatever the community sees as the goals and the needs. So the way I do this, and this comes out of the rural community development literature, is to use something called the community capitals framework. This gets me into trouble with sociologists sometimes because using the term capital implies buying into a capitalist system, right? The reason I do it is that most development is in fact about either explicitly or implicitly about working with capitalists, right? The store, be it the store owner or be it the factory. But also the notion of capital is a very useful notion because what is capital when we think about it? Capital is that which you invest to gain other resources, right? Capital isn't the end product, it's an investment, right? It's what you put into the system that you then build on to gain other resources. So within a capitalist framework, your job, what you're doing as you put in financing at the beginning of the project is not that you're just putting money out there. You're putting money out there to do something to create other resources that then gain, ultimately, if you're in a business, gain profit, right? But your startup capital is exactly that, startup capital. It's meant to be built on to gain something else. And so if we think of capital as not just being financial and built, which are the two traditional forms of capital, then we can start to think of what are the other resources that we need to invest in for the purposes of moving towards those goals that we all want, right? And so the community capitals framework started with 4 capitals, and as they started implementing it in rural communities, moved from just human, social, financial, and built to thinking about natural. Actually, it's wrong. These two were combined initially. Financial, built, and natural. To thinking about these 7 capitals. Right, now I'll go through what they are quickly. So that sort of gives you, so this is a conceptual model for understanding the development of community assets. Right? So natural capital is this notion of the natural resources that are embedded in any given place. Air, water. I've done this around community, so let me step back a minute and say, what I'm now going to do is show you how I did this with a community greening project in Flint, Michigan. The background is, how many of you, if I say Flint, Michigan, for how many of you is that meaningful?
We learned about some in Detroit.
Yeah. So think a slightly smaller version of Detroit, and you have Flint. Basically, it was a community that was a car town. It was Vehicle City, USA. In 1970, it actually had the highest median household income in the United States. By the year 2000, I think median household income by now is, I think, $21,000 a year. It may be even lower than that. The level of poverty is up above 50%. It is easily 40% of the city is abandoned. And neighborhoods will. The problem is that housing value, which was not high before the Great Recession, plummeted during the Great Recession and has not recovered. Median household value in Flint right now is $16,000. So if you're looking for a long-term investment in Michigan right now.
We thought about that, but we got some information that it's not going to change.
So what I did was I went in, there were 2 communities in Flint, Michigan that were interested in trying to clean up parks. And they had the investment of time and mowing resources from the MSU Turfgrass Center and a small grant from Scott's Turfgrass Foundation. Honestly, what Scott's wanted out of this was to demonstrate they could do something really positive with turfgrass, which gets a bad name often among environmentalists. But they asked if I would come in and help them figure out what difference this would make. Right? And so I said yes, and I think what makes the most sense is to try to think about this in terms of assets, right? In terms of an investment that could be built upon. So, so if we're thinking about natural capital in this case, then certainly air quality is important, but also stormwater and drainage, mitigating the heat island, but also cultural capital, right? And cultural capital is an interesting term. Cultural capital can be two different things. One is culture, right? And that's what we first think of, right? What are the expressions of culture in any given place, right? Ethnic festivals, right? Those kinds of things. But in my mind, what is more important is this way of seeing the world, right? Cosmovision, yeah? I mean, this way of understanding the way the world works. And understanding that, and part of that is whether people understand the world as doing things to them. Think about our Greenville, Kansas story again. Do things happen to them and they sort of take it, or do they respond? Right? This is it's a classic difference in cultural capital. Right? Who are we as a people? And people who have been increasingly beaten down either by the economic system or by oppressive governments the cultural capital that is built is one of waiting for things to happen, right? And that's very much on purpose. So in the coal mining communities in Appalachia, part of the development process in the last 20 years has been helping people to understand that if they decide to do something on their own, that A, it has value, and B, the coal company is no longer going to come along and quash it. Right? Because for years, cultural capital was created that if what you're doing is not explicitly creating more opportunity for the coal company, it will be quashed. Right? But also, but then that relates to human capital. And we often, if you read papers about human capital, they talk about this, education systems, right? The other part of human capital that's important to remember is what is the local knowledge, right? Human capital is skills, knowledge, and ability. So not only what is the educational attainment, but what are the other knowledges that people have? Right? What are the other things that people know that ought to be valued, that ought to be invested in? And also, what are the skills that should be valued and utilized, invested in? So you have people in rural communities who have this ability to lead across differences. And it may not be the most educated person who has that, right? And so how do you identify those areas of human capital, right? The person who can actually talk to the youth in the community and pull them into the development effort. How many of you have heard the term social capital? Okay. Social capital has gotten a lot of play in the last 20 years and it really is about the assets that are built through relationships. The thing that we've discovered, and depending on who you read, there's more variants of this, but I like to think about bonding social capital, which is your relationships with those who are close to you, who are like you. And those can be very positive, right? Again, Greenville, Kansas, right? They all knew each other. That was part of why they came together following the tornado. But quite honestly, the Russian mafia has a heck of a lot of bonding social capital, and for any of the rest of us in this room, I'm presuming at least, we don't think that's a good thing, right? So we're actually interested in balancing bonding social capital with bridging social capital, which is both the strength of weak ties, as Mark Granovetter described it in his famous book, his famous article on community development in poor rural communities, which is the ability to tie to those who you know peripherally who get you to other resources, but also the willingness to make ties across those with whom you are less comfortable, which is critical to making decisions that are inclusive, right? So you want to have both bonding social capital and bridging social capital. And the problem is if you just have one or the other, it can actually be very negative. But if combined in the right way, it can be very positive. Right? I mean, the problem with bridging social capital is clientelist municipal governments have a lot of bridging social capital, right? They don't work with people right around them, but they work with the folks who have money. Now, over time, what we came to understand was both of these had a relationship to, but neither of these properly defined political capital. And political capital is critical for, especially for poor urban communities as they are trying to address systemic problems. Because this political capital is about the ability of local groups to exercise power and or to influence power brokers within a community to leverage additional resources or to manage or to influence regulations. And so, so one of the things that that you need if you're going to revitalize your community within the context of a basket case city is the ability to figure out where you're going to get the resources to upgrade your community. And how are you going to work around the capricious regulations that keep you from doing what you need to do? And that's where political capital comes in, right? And you can see from this bit at the bottom, in my case in Flint, Michigan, these communities saw saw the development of urban green spaces as a stepping stone to growing social capital and community capacity to grow additional assets. But that took some connections with political forces, be they financial and monetary or regulatory, to get things done. Last but certainly not least is the ability to bring in financial resources. And the financial resources financial capital should be about investment of money that changes financial well-being for individuals and for the community. And build capital is about putting in new structures. One of the key things to always think about is the extent, and we talked about this before with gentrification, to which an investment creates private goods or public goods, right? In other words, who has access to it, right? You may be able to make a neighborhood look a lot better by putting in an exclusive swimming pool, but then what have you done in terms of those around the swimming pool, right? Development process. So I'm actually gonna, let's see, what have I done here? What I've put in here, I'm gonna skip over this stuff about sort of the mechanisms of doing the surveys and developing indicators out of each of these concepts. What I will say in my work just because I'm sort of realizing how late it's getting, in my work in Flint, Michigan, what I discovered was that Flint, you heard about Detroit and what's happened to Detroit. And outside of the area right around Joe Louis Arena and the ballpark and everything, I think Detroit is the same as Flint. Basically, unlike Ingham County, where if you demolish a house, you can see a rise in value in the other houses, there's no indication that you're getting an increase in housing value in these areas. Now, we haven't done a systematic study, but I have Zillowed the housing values in the neighborhoods where we've worked, and the best you can say is that housing values have slightly increased in one neighborhood and have stayed stable in one of the other neighborhoods, but they certainly haven't gone up. And in fact, in the one neighborhood, the new houses that were put in have remained vacant. They still can't get people to move in. So that's sort of your anecdotal determination. Likewise, in terms of built capital housing stock, you aren't seeing that much improvement in these neighborhoods, but you are seeing an improved open space. The piece that's really interesting here has been that, now I'm going back to do a more systematic study of what happened to crime rates in these neighborhoods, right? Right now, on my preliminary indication is that it is also true that crime rates haven't changed very much. Right? Violent crime is just as prevalent. But not only do neighbors trust each other more, but they feel safer. The anecdotal story of that is that from greening, neighbors came together, were talking about how do we deal with the fact that the police never come to our neighborhood. They set up a neighborhood cell phone alert system for when problems happened. The 2 Christmases ago, one of the community leaders was over with his daughter at his, and came out to the truck to get the presents for his granddaughter and was held up at gunpoint, right? And he got into the car, he alerted the neighbors, and the police never came, but all the neighbors came, right? And the guy ran away only with taking a little bit of money, not with doing any harm, right? So crime's still the same, but neighbors feel safer because they figured out they can do something, right?
Were the neighbors armed?
Probably.
It's a good question. I will say,
For sure.
I will say that at one point in one of my surveys, the question was, if your neighbor's house was being broken into, how would you respond? And it was predominantly men, so there's a machismo part to this, but the response among men was something to the akin of, look, under that table there by the door, there's a lead pipe and a Glock. I'm taking care of it. So maybe. I decided I wasn't going to ask.
Oh, sure.
But so crime rate's not down, but neighbors feel like they're safer, and they also talk about now going out with their children in the neighborhood and cleaning up the neighborhood. So so you get these notions of improvements in social capital, right? That people come together. That having a park that has been mowed now is the place where people can gather, so they get to know each other. Right? And it's from that they're able to have success and get more community buy-in. But there's also ongoing challenges. Among them being the fiscal malaise has led to increasing water rates. Right? You heard a bit about this if you heard about Detroit, right? And one of the issues is if you're going to put in a garden in these neighborhoods, which a number of them have, you need to have water during the month of July, we don't get a lot of rain here. So if you're going to have a successful garden, you've got to figure out a way to water it. Right? And so just turning on the municipal water system isn't going to be the answer. They've had to come up with other means to do that, and those have fallen apart occasionally. So it's now about 20 of. I have a good bit more I could do. I could talk, maybe I should just talk quickly about the other research that I've done rather than sort of plowing through the slides. I have done work, in addition to looking at urban greening, I have done more sort of classic sociology work looking at municipal services and who gets them, who doesn't. And thinking about what the mechanisms are that have led to situations like Detroit's or like Flint's, where you have water rates that frankly are not affordable for a good portion of the population. And what I have done is gone back and looked at what I should say. What I've done is gone back and looked at the structural drivers, right? Which is to say, what is it that leads cities to the place where they have water systems that can only be supported if you charge rates that are just way above what most of us would expect to pay in the United States. And then what leads families to make choices regarding the extent to which they're going to pay for those things. And what I'm finding is that we have, understanding this as a problem of water system management leaves you without a lot of alternatives. Rather thinking about this as an issue that involves a much more integrated set of factors leads you to places where you can think in a number of ways about, over the long term, how will we get ourselves out of this, and over the short term, how do we provide services to those who are legitimately having problems paying for water, or for water, for energy, and understanding that we can't think of water alone. Right? So in the city of Detroit, we have a number of cases where we talk to people who were effectively without water and sanitation services, not because they couldn't pay the water bill, but because they ran out of money in the middle of the winter and the pipes burst and they don't have the money to repair the pipes, right? So really starting to think about these as integrated bundles of services that need to be addressed. And that has implications for the way that we deal with basic services in the United States. Again, we deal with basic services as piecemeal, right? And so Catholic Relief has a pot of money to do one-time assistance for water rates. They have LIHEAP money to give to people for energy. Rather than bringing people in and thinking about, okay, so here's your whole here's what you have to pay for monthly household rates. How do we deal with that? Right? And thinking about how do we make it so that people can pay? What are the mechanisms so that they can pay? And what are the knowledge? What's the knowledge and what are the assets that need to be in place to make it so they can pay? And the last thing is then thinking of things like stormwater as not unrelated to all of these. One of the things that we've done in the United States is effectively freak out about how much of the water was running off of our municipal systems into our water systems. And we've come in with compliance orders across the Midwest, certainly, but really across the country, saying that you need to put in a multi-million-dollar, sometimes billion-dollar system to collect stormwater. Well, who do you think ends up paying for that? And when they do pay for that, let's think about who in the community can afford it and who can't. And so there's a very interesting study in Newport, Kentucky, where they went back and they looked at the affordability of paying for a compliance order on stormwater and discovered that the bottom 2 quintiles of the community were unable to afford it. That it pushed water rates to 5, 6, 7% of income, and these were for people that were already struggling making payments. And so if we're blind to those things, we're not going to be able to handle these very big integrated problems that we're addressing you're right.
Exactly, these integrated problems, as you said, who should be caring about these problems? Because the robotic companies can say, okay, it's the responsibility of someone else to make them, much more economically, viable families, so that they can pay. Everyone can put the blame on the other one.
Yeah, and I think what we have to start are processes that bring all of those, everyone who's putting the blame on everyone else together. And part of that, frankly, is bringing the NGOs into the room, because the compliance orders are being pushed by EPA, but EPA is being pushed by environmental NGOs. Not without reason, but the environmental NGOs are doing what Herbert Marcuse called one-cell thinking, right? And just thinking about what's it going to take to clean up our waterways without thinking about the broader feedbacks, right? And so I think we need to be involved in municipalities, but then nationally in much more broad-ranging conversations about how do we deal with these issues in a realistic way. And the problem is that no one of those entities can see their interest in bringing everyone together, right? The water, and I know this because I work with the water utilities nationally, they're very happy to have cessation of compliance orders. But you want to bring them together and start saying that you have to think about how your water rates are going to relate to energy bills. Then they start saying, wait, right? So.
What do you see as the business community's role here as well? Because I know that, for instance, in this area, several years ago, when they tried to implement a rain fee, there was a scale where, depending on how many square feet of permeable, soil or concrete you had, would determine what your rate was. So at the end of the day, residential ratepayers would pay a lower rate, but yet, large manufacturing concerns would pay a higher rate. So where does the business community fit into this as well?
Well, I think that's a conversation I'd love to have more about that, and how, because I don't know, I think it depends on the business community to a certain extent, but I think thinking creatively about how to bring the business community into the conversation is a very worthy thing. And I think, because honestly, the business community has very little interest as a whole. There obviously are individual businesses that are benefiting, but very little interest as a whole in flinting, in seeing water rates spike and seeing people foreclosed on because they can't pay their water bills, and having that downward spiral, right? I mean, obviously there are individual businesses within the business community who absolutely feed on that kind of process. But I think as the Chamber of Commerce, if they're at all wise, see that as a worst case scenario. And so can we bring them together to think about how do we and likewise the business community, Chamber of Commerce, Association of Small Businesses, has very little interest in seeing Michigan waterways labeled for numbers of beach closings, right? I mean, so there's a lot of interest there. Now, what I don't know is how you bring them together. And what I'd love to have conversations about is how do you bring the business community together to think about these more interesting, integrated, system-wide solutions to these issues. All right, yeah.
I have a question about this. We have been hearing about this creating communities to attract talent. I have already asked that question, but it's not very clear for me. And for example, talking about this park coffee shop that you put, and you said, so the drug dealers are moving another place. So they are not disappearing. They are like, and these kind of things stimulates segregation in some kind of, and I do not understand. Are been done the same efforts in give these people new places, new opportunities, to increase or to even know about these assets, what you were talking about?
Well, and this is one of the criticisms of community-based initiatives. Right? So it's actually more housed in geography and anthropology, but some of us use it in sociology. There's a theory of urban political ecology that is, effectively it's a Marxian approach to thinking about cities and including environmental services. They would say that these sort of neighborhood level efforts to fix problems just move them around and do exactly what you say. Just create enclaves of real social isolation, right? You push all of the drug dealers and the prostitutes and everything into the one part of almost a no-go area, right, in a city where, and of course, where do they go? Well, the people, there are non-drug dealers and prostitutes who end up being the receiving place just because they happen to be the poorest in the community, right? The other way, what some people have responded is that it is a matter of political will and resources, the extent to which we think about, we simply think of these as zero-sum games. So part of what happens in a place like Flint is when you have a decline in citywide, cities close, the schools close. When the schools close, the anchor for the neighborhood leaves. When the anchor for the neighborhood leaves, you end up with social disorder. You end up with increasing numbers of young people who don't even get a high school degree, much less go on to college, making their job prospects minimal in our modern society, which then pushes them, right? Again, 18 to 24-year-olds in Flint, there's probably 45% unemployment. Now, what are they going to do to make a living? What are they going to do to occupy their time? Well, they're going to use the informal economy, which in the context of Flint means that they're engaged in the sex trade and in the drug trade, right? And then accompanied with that, when you don't have a police force, how do they stake out their markets? Well, they do it with handguns, right? And so you end up with this spiral that spiraled down. The thing about implementing these kinds of asset-driven initiatives is we can do it where neighborhoods ask us to come in. We can also do it in those places where we can find opportunities to intervene, to build social cohesion, even if there's not social cohesion around. And through that, to create opportunities, even in the poorest neighborhoods, to start reversing the downward spiral. Right? And in the rural community literature, there's a theory of spiraling up. So the intervention, again, they argue that the intervention is largely social and cultural. Right? If you can increase these social connections, and through that, increase the evidence that if you do something for yourself, other than dealing drugs and engaging in the sex trade, that you can have a better life, that you can start a spiral up, even in the poorest neighborhoods. And really the issue is in starting those spiraling up and keeping in mind the constant need for advocacy, so that as the neighborhood improves, there is also intervention from the state to do things like put in schools that will provide that place where people come together and learn, or put in alternative education programs that can give those young people the skills so they can do something other than these informal activities. So that's sort of the optimistic rose-colored glasses response to this notion that you're just pushing around those who are causing problems anyway. But there have been some efforts to do that in places like Chicago, and arguably there are efforts ongoing in places like Detroit and Flint. to try to start that process, right? And to get just a foothold in the system to move it from spiraling down to spiraling up. And that's ultimately what we'd like to see, right? And people don't have to be involved. There will always be some informal economy, but it's at a level right now in a place like Flint, Michigan, that's that reminds you of the horrible movies you saw about Al Capone in the, from the 1920s, right? And certainly we can do better than that. Okay. I think
This we may I ask this last question maybe. We saw different models. In Hong Kong, the society is governed in a certain way. The city specifically, to put a certain kind of order. In Mexico, that's another way. In Dubai, you see a total different, very leadership oriented. In Turkey, the same. To Islam, to UAE maybe. But I know that there is no best practice that can be applied, everywhere. But this we that you're talking about now, I would like to get your perspective. This we is who, in USA? Is it the government? Is it this, who is this we who should do better, to solve the problem?
Everybody.
Yeah, I think it has to be. But your question is well put, because it is. On the one hand, it's everybody. On the other hand, everybody is self-selected, and so so who is the we that sits at the table to start coming up with these new programs, and how do we make that we inclusive of everyone who needs to be at the table, right? And so I have a certain role as an academic who studies these things. Right? Maybe I should be at the table for some part of it. But those people who are doing community work in Flint need to be there even more than me, right? They are the ones who really know the local conditions in Flint. But if it's just them, and not people who can make it to the level of the business community who can make investments, to the governor's office where they can allocate resources, to the, and especially in the context of Flint where the city council has very little power, but an appointee of the governor has a lot of power. To the people who are involved in the administration does schooling, right? All of those folks need to be brought together. And so I think thinking about who the we is really important. I think it's contextual to a certain extent, depending on where you are. Right? I mean, in Lansing, it can be much more localized effort because they're not under effectively fiscal receivership at this point. So I think that's an important question that I think for each individual place you have to think about who holds what strings to what part of the system.
Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.